Hey, everybody, welcome back to part two of our little mini series here on the three pillars of trauma informed care. Back with Roy again and Emma. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Doing well.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in again. We're going to dig into connection and self regulation, the second and third pillars of trauma informed care. And so if you didn't listen to the first episode where we talked about this, go back to that one and listen where we talk a lot about felt safety, that first pillar. It's really good, and it really these build on each other, and so you really can't have one without the other. So let's start with connection. Emma, tell us about connection. How do you define connection?
Yeah, connection is really just being there. Trying to define connection without using the word connection is really hard, honestly. Connecting with others, being present, finding things in common, even when you don't, asking questions, getting to know that person. And really just, getting to know that person to a root
Sure.
of things. I think it's important to note when we're talking about connection, though, is that we're talking about healthy connection, obviously, because there is unhealthy connection in this. But we really focus on the healthy connection when we're talking about the three pillars.
And I like that you were use the word be present, which I think can be hard for a lot of Americans. There's a lot going on. There's always things vying for our attention. It's hard if you're a parent of multiple children. I kind of joke with people, if you're a parent and you just have one child, there's no shade here, but it's like, oh, I'm so busy, I have one child. And it's like, well, then you have a couple more, and it gets your attention gets divided, right? It can be really difficult. And so there might be some parents who are listening, and already we feel guilty. It's like, oh, I'm not as present as I want to be. And so there's no guilt. We're not trying to throw guilt on people. We struggle to connect, and that's why we're talking about this. That's why we want to help. That's why we need to grow ourselves as we think about connection. So we talk about connection all the time. Roy, you and I talk about connection,
Yep.
I think multiple times in the first season. When you think about this pillar and really what we do at CH, we're connecting people, churches, organizations all the time. Why is it so essential to what we do at CH?
Yeah, I think let me take a quick rabbit trail. I think, we've talked about felt safety, connection, and self-regulation. I mean, these, when we usually unpack these things, they're not in 30 minutes or 15 minutes. Yep. These are all day trainings. And so, part of the conversations we're having is really just kind of overview and principles, right? There's so much to it, right? Because, Emma would start talking about connection, and the next thing you know, you'd have a slide on the attachment cycle, and you start understanding, there's a lot of theory and science and, practice behind a lot of the things that we're talking about. Connection is rooted for me in trust. And so you cannot operate interpersonally as an organization without trust, which for me, and I love what Emma said, it's not just healthy connections. I would also say, trust is built through healthy and consistent connections. It requires a ton of intentionality. I have 3 kids. I love all of them equally. Some need it more at times than the others need it at times. But my capacity to love them has continues to grow for them, not lessen for them. But I have to be super intentional, not with my own needs. I have to be super aware of my needs, but I need to be aware of where my daughters. I have a 16-year-old daughter, I have a 20-year-old daughter, and then I have a 25-year-old son. All of them are very, very different places. And I have to be so intentional and consistent with them feeling safe around me. Yep. And so that takes a lot of work. And so that's, to your answer to your question, James, it is about trust that requires my presence, but my intentional presence about not where I am at, but where they are at, and can I meet them where they're at? And if they don't trust me, it's never going to happen. And so I think that's a critical part of the conversation we're having.
That's great. So Emma, what does connection look like in everyday life? We asked this same question when we talked about felt safety. What are some examples with children and adults? Like how do we connect with people? We talk about being present, but like what are how about it practically?
Yeah. So I think it's just the being present, like he said, and putting down the phone, taking the time to get to know the people in your church, the kids in your home, your own children, beyond just the surface level of how was your day, right? What was the best part? What was the worst part? Really getting to know kind of how a person ticks, what it excites them and what doesn't. So I think like small groups, community groups, really the root of the church doing that is to build a connection so that that is established and there's a positive relationship there. I think positive relationships, we know from science, are so important and crucial for the development of healthy development in terms of kids. The way a baby enters the world and is welcomed into the world, and the fact that a mom carries that baby for 9 months, there's connection being formed from the very beginning.
Yep.
And so obviously God has created us to connect as human beings, and knowing that whether it's someone in your home, blood related like a child, or someone just in your congregation.
That's good. Go ahead, Roy.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I think about a real practical tip, dinner time. Dinner time, since it's been researched, which it's one of the most healthiest things. Well, it's actually deemed as one of those things that when you look at thriving or flourishing families, they look at the behaviors of that family. They have consistent dinner time together. So having dinner together 4 times, I think the research is 4 times a week, without any distractions, no technology, no TV on, phones away, but you're having really intentional conversations, right? Hey, what was your high of the day? What was your low of the day? Those kinds of interactions. Again, we talked about felt safety. We're being fed, we're drinking water. So our body is feeling safe. It's an incredible opportunity to strengthen the relationships that are of the people sitting around their table. It's an incredible opportunity for connection as dinner time. And,
that's really good.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus ate meals with people. He connected over meals. I want to share some questions here. My wife sent me this text probably back close to the first or second week of school. Parents, we often ask our kids, how was school? And I remember when my parents asked me that question. And I'd say, fine, and whatever. So she, I don't know if she found this, but here's what she sent me. Instead of asking, how was school? Here's 5 other questions, which are essentially connection questions. And I love these. And so I commend them to you parents out there, or, your spouse comes home from work, people at church. We often ask people at church, oh, how was your week? Well, here's some great substitutes for that. What made you smile today? Who did you sit with at lunch? If you could change one thing about today, what would it be? What was the hardest thing about today? And tell me something you know today that you didn't know yesterday. And so on the first day, my wife sent me this. I picked up the kids and I got through 4 out of the 5 questions pretty organically in conversation. The kids that I picked up that day, they're 10 and 8. So they weren't really clued in that I was interviewing them with these questions, but it really did help. It helped me connect with them rather than how was your day? Fine. And then we just were quiet and we listened to music all the way home. And so that was good. And it just reminded me, it helped kids. It helps put a tangible spin on the conversation so they can actually think of concrete things that happened in the day. And I was able to connect with them. But it gets at what you're saying, Roy, like be intentional when you eat a meal, and you can work these questions into a meal. I love when we eat together almost every night, and it's super valuable.
Well, and looking at those times you spend, my wife and I were house parents and raising, 8 to 10 girls that weren't ours, plus our own, one of the other great things that we used was play. Play is an incredible time to really ask some of those right questions because you're engaging them in a very different kind of spatial space and relational space. And so you learn a lot about the kids, you learn a lot about yourself, but it's also another great time where you get to build and strengthen your relationships in ways that's not just sitting across or having a one-on-one, or especially not doing when you're correcting behavior. I mean, that might not be the best time to use connection, is when you're correcting, but finding those times when the walls are down, that you can really continue to build. Can I trust dad? Can I trust mom? Can I trust my youth leader?
Yep.
With these things? And again, those questions were great, but it's just approaching your time together differently in a way that allows for the strengthening of the relationships. And how do I strengthen trust, and not taking it for granted as well.
That's good. So Emma, last question here on connection, and then we'll move on to self-regulation. But you've trained a ton of foster parents, and a lot of people may not be more relationally bent. Some of them might be more task oriented. And so how do you encourage people who are really task oriented to kind of overcome that so that they can focus on connecting? Because I'll tell you, when I get home from work, it's like, okay, I want to help, want to make sure we're getting ready for dinner. And, I want to connect with my wife and say, okay, what needs to get done here? What do the kids need? And there's not always time for that connection, or at least in my brain, there's not, because things got to get done. So how do you encourage people who kind of are bent toward task over people?
Yeah. And James, I'd say that our society tells us to be like that, like you just explained, right? Our society tells us that we're too busy for that we're too busy. And then our society now, like our world, has given us a cell phone where, like that's always a distraction to us. And we're thinking we are connecting, but Facebook's not really great for actually connecting to the term of connecting that we're talking about here. And so for people like that, I recommend, like I've had conversations with foster parents about like, okay, we're going to have to schedule in a time for you to connect, whether that's you taking a kiddo to go get ice cream and you're driving. What do you do in a car with a 13-year-old when you're driving and you tell them, hey, you can't have your phone out? Like, I can't have my phone either. We're going to sit here and talk. And maybe that's talking over the fact that like, maybe as we build up to that, this is a new kid in my home, and speaking specific to foster care, but it could be even small group or whatever. And you allow a kid to be the DJ. Obviously you put in parameters around that, but then connecting on the music they're talking about. Oh, that's similar to a song that I had growing up, or I would have never listened to that song before. Why do you like this band? And having those moments for them to explain those things. Those kids don't know that we're connecting. They don't understand the purpose of that. But I think scheduling that out for those families who are like, I don't have time for this, because that's how it feels.
Plan spontaneity.
Yes.
Planning. Yes. I like that. Let's plan to connect.
Right. And I think, even one of my daughter's favorite things is movies, right? Which movies aren't a great time to connect. So we don't do a ton of family movie nights. Those come very few and far between, but we'll play games together, right? Because that gives us a time to laugh, connect, do a puzzle, things like that. Or family walks. We have not done very well at that recently because this 100-degree weather is ruining that for everyone. But family walks allow that space. But just, and I think us as parents, us as the adults, have to plan for that.
That's good.
I think in like a church setting, in a youth group setting, again, we talked about this in part A, how we get so bent on like sticking to the curriculum when it's like let's just create a time for us to connect and get to know each other, even in small groups as an adult. Are we being like, hey, no, we need to get through this Bible study, or being like, you know what, our group today just really needs this time to connect and get to know each other.
That's good. I love that. Great stuff. Okay, let's move towards self-regulation, which probably of the three, maybe the hardest to understand. It might be the hardest to practice, because when you're not regulated, we'll get into what that means here in a minute, but when you're not regulated, it's hard to come out. It's hard to come out, right? And to be at a place where you're actually stable and you can breathe. And so we'll talk about self-regulation really for kids and people who are vulnerable that we want to serve and support, but also for us. Because in some sense, we talked about in the first episode, we all have vulnerabilities. We're all in process. And so you might think, oh, I'm here to serve and support this person, this child, this parent. Well, you have needs too. You haven't arrived. So Emma, what is self-regulation?
Yeah. So self-regulation is the ability to maintain or regulate yourself emotionally, physically. So it's those times where I describe it for those who are unfamiliar, where you're driving down a road and your light is green and you're going, but a car pulls out and drives right in front of you and turns red, and you immediately jump into kind of a defensive, whether it's screaming, maybe you say a bad word. We've all been there. I'm actually one who really struggles with road rage at times as well, right? And we jump into this very state of mind. We're like, oh crap. But it's instead the ability, self-regulation would be the ability then where that doesn't happen. And instead I'm able to take a deep breath and regulate my emotions, get back to that level field, the calm point, kind of starting point a calm line on a graph.
Yep. Okay, that's good. So you use driving as an example. When we think about our work with kids, how do kids struggle to self-regulate? I mean, I think I have some idea. I have 4 kids, so I have some idea, but Can you give us some examples of when and where and why do kids struggle to self-regulate?
Yeah. When we talk about what we see the most in terms of not being able to self-regulate is, so we often I'll use this example first. Let's go here first. We do engine plates with children often here at Christian Heritage. So we think of like a half circle. In the middle is green. So it's the thermometer, right, of your car, tells you the temperature of your car. On one side, it's blue. In the middle is green, as I already said, and then red. When we think of people not being regulated, we often think of them being in that red zone, but they could also be in that blue zone. So the kids that we think of when there is regulation issues are the ones bouncing off the walls. They can't sit in their seat. They're the ones that we said, hey, it's time to go to song time or story time. And they're like, no, and they're throwing things or just like running the pews, whatever that looks like. But there's also this state in that blue where they don't want to do anything. Their engine, we say, I'll ask people in meetings sometimes because our whole staff are trained on engines. I'll be like, how's your engine running? The answer I'm looking for is green, meaning that they're able to self-regulate. They're in a calm state. They haven't dipped below into that negative or dipped up into a high positive. And so also in that blue is extra tired. So that's where I say the state of hangriness lies, is that a lot of regulation even plays into what we were talking about earlier, is meeting those basic needs of food, water. Bathroom breaks are a huge one as well. See kids dysregulate in terms, normally that would be a red zone. But thinking through regulation on both sides of that.
Yep. That's good. I can't tell you how many times, I mean, I've learned this late. And then with my 4th child, he might just have a tough moment. And I'm like, man, do you have to go to the bathroom? And and I'm like, okay. And I'm thankful that I remembered that. I remember hey, right, I did something well. I asked him if he had to go to the bathroom. So I think one of the hard things to do as adults who want to care for kids, is those are scary moments. A lot of people who get into caring for a child, or maybe even mentoring an adult who had a traumatic childhood, you feel overwhelmed. And you're like, I'm never going to be able to help them self-regulate because I can't regulate myself. I blow up because somebody drove in front of me in traffic. And this kid blows up here and I'm going to just fly off the handle too. So is it as simple as, okay, foster parent, host home, mentor, Sunday school teacher, whoever, take a sip of water, take a breath? Is that kind of what you coach people through as well?
Sometimes, but I will say the first thing that we go through in terms of any of our host home training, our volunteer family mentor training, our foster parent training, and this is just what I would tell anyone, is that you have to be so crucially honest with yourself to know where you are at, right? Am I able to regulate myself? It's not a matter of it's not a thought of at some point you will end up getting triggered. Not an if I get triggered, it's a when I get triggered. And so really knowing what's going to set you off and doing that self-discovery to kind of think about that, whether that's from your past, right? I've already admitted driving's one of them for me. I believe that there's at least one more person on this call who that's the same for him.
It's not me. It's not me.
It's true.
Sorry, just had to do that.
Dang it.
But yes, we all have those things.
We're not editing that out either. That's going in.
That's saying
That's
it.
awesome.
I'm so
All
glad.
going to hear that one. Yep.
Maybe
didn't
they'll
even-
invite me
you didn't
back
even
for
have a
another
response.
podcast
Hey,
episode.
great example of felt safety when you could throw your boss under the bus.
That is
publicly.
great.
That's felt safety right there.
So
Um,
go ahead, Emma. Keep going.
Yeah, so just being aware of where we're all at. Like Rory owns the fact that he, doesn't do well driving if there's not good drivers around him. And he's very aware of that. So yeah, connecting in the car might not be the best place for him, right? And being aware that that might be a trigger to him.
I'm getting better. All right. I'm getting
I
better.
know. I'm just using you as a really healthy example right now.
We're all in process.
And so that's there's times in our life where we, like we're maybe volunteering in child development or in the child curriculum at church is good for you, but there's times where that might not be. And so knowing that and knowing the other things you have in your life, because we know that life happens.
Yep.
And things come into our life.
I think
so knowing where we're at.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is kind of expectations, right? You go into, I'm serving in children's ministry. I'm going to be a foster parent. I'm going to be a host home. I'm serving with my church, and I'm going to encounter some people today who are maybe homeless or vulnerable. Like having the right expectations has helped me to be able to self-regulate, because I kind of coach or, teach myself, self-talk to myself before I go into a situation. Now, it's not perfect, right? Something just might totally throw you for a loop and you just fly off the handle. It happens. We're human.
And I think it's important to also know your people, right? We all have our people through being connected and felt safety and all of that.
Yep.
And those people are able to help us co-regulate. And
That's
really,
good.
that's what we are being called to do in this situation where we have a kid. And like your example was great, James, in terms of asking your son, hey, do you need to use the restroom? In that moment, you were able to be his co-regulator. Like he needed you to tell him that like, oh yeah, that's what's going on in this moment. I can't realize that. I don't have the words for that right now. But that's a huge teaching moment for him to be able to self-regulate.
Yep.
So when we think of trauma, we think of a lot of our staff's job in direct care roles is that they're there to co-regulate with adults or kids.
That's good.
Well, I was just going to add, I think co-regulation is a big part of this, because it's something that I think my wife and I have worked really hard at, is really, when we talk about the phones, we use it as a way to connect with each other to say, okay, where are you? How was your day? And it's not just, hey, I'm fine. It's kind of that engine plate of I'm kind of in the red right now, or I'm in the green or blue. And we don't use that specific language, but part of that now lets me know when I show up at home and she subs in the public schools, I'm here doing our work. I mean, we could have very stressful days as we're dealing with other people and handling lots of different situations. And so both of us could come in completely deregulated. And so we need to know where each other is at. And so I think even with your spouse, you need to be co-regulators with each other. I don't even think that's a choice. Like you have to be committed to that process. If not, you will completely continue to deregulate each other, where, again, in marriages, I think of, number one reasons for divorce, irreconcilable differences, communication. I mean, your ability to co-regulate each other is absolutely critical to the health of your marriage, so that you can be what your kids need you to be. The last thing your kids need is for mom and dad to be deregulated, because they're not, kind of helping each other out in their own spaces. That's huge.
Good.
And I think an important thing to know about this too, if you feel like you're someone who does seem to not regulate very well, is that the part of the brain that this is in, which is in the orbital frontal cortex, I believe is where this one's at, is one of the pieces of the brain that's the most plastic. Meaning that if this is something that you struggle with, that your brain can rewire itself rather pretty easily by working with people who can help you co-regulate, so that you can build up to that self-regulation.
That's good. We could, I don't want to get into this too deep, but we could probably talk a little bit about, you talk about co-regulating and how really in prayer, even, God is our co-regulator. I think a lot of the Psalms where the psalmist he's having a moment or she's having a moment, and you're like, they feel scared, they feel afraid, they're blowing up. I mean, if you've read through the Psalms, and so maybe we could talk just for a minute about how do we go to the Lord in prayer when we are just beside ourselves. I know I do it all the time. I mean, a lot of my prayers are just, I am frustrated. I am angry. I am so sad. Like I'm depressed. I'm disappointed, God. Like how could you do this? Right. And it's like, I know the answers. Like I know the theological answers. I know God's good, but I'm still a little dysregulated and I need to go to him in prayer. And so I don't know if you guys have ever thought about that, but even as we were just talking, I thought, a lot of people in Psalms, they're a little dysregulated and they need God to meet them where they're at. So any thoughts that way?
Yeah, I think simply a Sunday school answer would be like we learn as a 5-year-old, right? We probably had a lesson on take it all to the Lord in prayer, right? Take the lows, the highs, everything. And so even in that moment where you need regulation, take it to him. He can hold it. That's
good.
That's excellent.
All right, last thing here. Let's talk about children's ministry specifically. We mentioned, it's important to know if it's a good place or, if you're in a good spot to be able to volunteer in a children's ministry. But a lot of volunteers don't have trauma-informed training. They may not have the support behind them, but they want to serve. And all of a sudden they encounter a child who's struggling. Maybe it's a child who's developmentally delayed. Maybe the child has other things going on that nobody really knows about. Do all children's volunteers need trauma-informed training? Do children's directors? We'd probably say yes, come to one of our trainings. We'd love to help you. But, how would you come alongside somebody in that spot, Emma? And where would you recommend they go for support when they're like, hey, I want to grow. I want to do this. I want to serve my church. But man, there's some kids that I'm struggling with at church. I don't know how to help them.
Yeah. Like you said, come to one of our trainings. There's lots of research online. TBRI is a great basic of like staying connected with kids and how to actually do that. We talked about a lot of like getting on their level, staying in there. I think a good part of children's ministry, and Roy probably does this in his role with middle school boys too, is that he's like, okay, it's only an hour, it's only 2 hours. I have 30 minutes left, right? And knowing like that time, like what's left in that time, you kind of count down to that, but hanging in there for the time that you have to, and knowing when you need help, and going to get that help, and knowing that that's okay at times to ask for help, but really just being present with the children, just being present with anybody is doing so much more good work in what those children, what those adults need in that moment.
That's great. And then Roy, I'm going to toss this one to you, and we didn't have this in our notes, so maybe you didn't prepare for it, but we work with a lot of adults in churches who, they have their own trauma. And they might struggle to self-regulate, and something just might hit them wrong in a sermon, in a small group, in a conversation in the hallway, in between services, or in a small group at home. Or maybe maybe they don't go to church, but you know them from work. And you want to help someone and they just struggle to self-regulate. How do you meet adults where they're at? It's, you don't look at an adult. You don't go, hey, do you need to go to the bathroom? Do you need a drink of water? Like we kind of laugh, and it would be ridiculous to say that. But how do you serve and support adults who are in that spot where maybe they're struggling to self-regulate, and you're like, I want to love this person where they're at. I don't know what to do.
Man, I think every individual circumstance, you're going to have to. There's so many factors that take into play. So I think where's that person at? The timing of things. Are they making it unsafe for others? There's a lot that goes into that. But I think the more that you can be aware of yourself, be aware of where they're at and what the impact they're having on others, you want to make safety the highest priority. And so I would think is do as much as you can to deregulate that situation. And so, if they're creating an intense situation is, hey, can we go talk about this outside? Or, getting them to a place where you can at least allow them to feel like they have some choices about, the situation, or setting clear boundaries like, hey, if this continues, this is what's going to happen. Like, you need to know what's going to happen, or you've been given the authority to know what's going to happen. A lot of churches today have their own security, and so they have protocols in place. So I think it's being able to, I think you can care well for people without allowing them to kind of hijack the situation and getting them into place. I think you can do that while allowing them to keep their honor, whatever respect they might have for themselves. I think there's ways of doing that, but you can't be soft on that. You know what I mean? You can't allow just anything to go. I think you can care well for people in those situations, but there's a lot to consider.
That's good.
So,
Emma, anything to add, Emma?
No, I think he nailed it on the head.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll stop there. So this has been really good and probably just scratching the surface, obviously.
Yeah.
Roy had mentioned, in some of our trainings, you're going to get a lot more content in terms of time. I will add something exciting. Later this month, we're going to be launching a new website. And so at some point on our blog, we'll have articles that cover each one of these topics. And so you could head there to find those. And we'll put some resources in the show notes in case you want to dig in more to felt safety, connection, and self-regulation. So Emma and Roy, thanks for joining us.
Great conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Conversation. Emma, thanks for all that you do in our training, on our training team. And I know that our foster parents, host homes, mentors, volunteers, they appreciate it so much. So, well, everybody, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.